Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host, Michael Howard, the Head of Marketing at InfoTools. Today, we're joined by John Geraci, the President at Crux Research, author of the recently published book, Poll-arized, Why Americans Don't Trust the Polls. And it's this latter aspect that we're going to be focusing on today. So without getting political, if that's all possible, John, thanks for joining us on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks for having me.
You're quite welcome. So what's the most significant thing you're going to tell us today?
Well, I hope I say a lot of significant things, but I really hope to convince you and anyone listening that we have some serious data quality issues across all types of survey research these days. And, even in the book and here, I use election polls to illustrate and demonstrate that. Our election pollsters are actually doing a pretty darn good job given all the constraints they face, but it really isn't good enough in the eyes of the consumers of polls, the public, our officials, the media. And I don't think they're focusing on the right things to improve the polls. And the same thing, I think, can be said for survey researchers. The polling and insights field, I feel, has for a long time ignored what I would call an elephant in the room, which is the poor response rates we get to our surveys. The most significant thing I think I'm going to say today, or try to convince you of, is that if we don't improve our response rates, survey research and polling as we know it will no longer exist much longer. And I'll give you some statistics and along the way. We focus a lot on what happens when respondents hit the front of our surveys. I listened to a whole bunch of these podcasts in preparation for this, and recently you've had a number of people talking about data quality. And what I noticed is they're all talking about what happens when the 5% of the people we invite to the survey actually show up and how we're going to preserve them and make sure they're. But no one's talking about the 95% that don't even show up. And to me, that's far more significant and far more consequential to the quality problems we have. Low response rates are at the core of our problems. And I really think the through line and the insight of the book, Poll-arized, is really that what methodologists are doing and pollsters are doing is they're doubling down on technology and methodology. And I try to make the case that technology and methodology, if anything, have been more the cause of the problems than solutions to the problems. So, this hopefully is going to be a good spirited little debate we're going to have. I did a poll for the book, the problem is there. No one denies the problem. Trust in pollsters in the U.S. is at 17% right now. It was 45% just 6 years ago. Look up the number here. Only 12% of the American population thinks the U.S. election pollsters are going to get the election right in 2024. So we have a serious lack of trust thing. Our trust level is just above members of Congress and just above used car salesmen in the U.S. So we have a serious trust issue. And again, that's the key takeaways. The key takeaways I have, I definitely put in the context of election polls. The election pollsters are focusing almost exclusively on sampling and sampling error, when the reality is there's all sorts of errors on surveys, and non-response error is just so much more important than the ones we're actually working on. And again, if we don't do something about response rates, survey research really can't exist much lower. They're going to go to zero pretty soon.
Wow.
So, long-winded intro of what I'm going to try to do here.
No, there's a lot to unpack in that. So thank you for sharing. Should be a very interesting one as well. So can you give us a little context around your career in the market research world and what led you to write a book on the lack of trust in polls?
Yeah. I've worked in survey research for about 30 years. I started in 1989. So I've been around a little while. I'm currently the president of Crux Research. So we're a boutique agency in the States, primarily work for nonprofits and large organizations that work with young people or families. So youth and family research has kind of always been our thing. Mm-hmm. Before I launched Crux in 2006, I worked for about 15 years at Harris Interactive. And, that's best known for the Harris Poll, one of the really best known polling brands in the world. And most consequentially, during the time I was there, Harris was really the market pioneer in terms of leading the charge of the transition from telephone to online polling. You could say that we were ahead of ourselves. So I was really around a lot of the methodologists and a lot of the kind of cutting edge things that are still in place today for how we do non-probability sampling. So I sort of feel like I'm in a decent position to write this book because I've worked as an election pollster, but I've done a lot more survey research for sure. The projects I do are way more complex than an election poll. And, that is sort of what led me to write the book to begin with, was understanding that sort of like the election pollsters can't get it right. Why should my clients trust me to get it right when what I do is so much more complicated than an election poll? So, yeah. So anyway, I've been around for a while, almost entirely on the supplier side, but worked with a lot of different organizations throughout the world.
Yeah, very cool. So can you shed some light on the methodologies you used for writing this book? How did you go about knowing that it is such a diverse subject?
Yeah, it is. And and I'm not a particularly political person. I tell everyone, if you read this book, if I did a good job, you'll have no idea where I stand politically. That was my goal on this. But the book was sort of accidental, and it was inspired by the sleepless night I had during the 2020 election in the States, right? So I went to bed not 100% sure who the next president was going to be, but that isn't why I was losing sleep, right? I was very concerned that sort of the pollsters did it again, right? There was probably one thing, we're so polarized in the States that there was probably one thing everyone agreed upon after the election, and that was that the pollsters blew it. That's probably the one thing that wasn't polarizing. And sort of like the election sort of seemed like it had become this referendum on the polls as much as a way to choose the president. And the pollsters were just getting killed in the media unfairly in many, many ways. And so I had posted the night before the election on our blog, our corporate blog, a whole bunch of reasons of why I thought the pollsters were going to nail it this time. They were going to get it right. I looked at what they had adjusted after 2016. I was like, they're going to get it right. And I was really embarrassed because the reality is 2020 election, they were off by about twice as much as they were in 2016. So I had a lot of egg on my face, right? I was really, really nervous about that. And again, I was losing sleep over the question I said. I was wondering if I was a client, I would have picked up the phone the next day to anyone I had a study going with and said, look, what I'm doing with you is so much more complicated than an election poll. If these guys can't get this right, why should I entrust all this money to you? And the reason I wrote the book is I didn't think I had a very good answer to that question. And I had a boss once that always told me there was a saying that if you really want to learn a subject, you should teach it, right? I'll tell you this, you really want to learn a subject, write a book about it. I learned so much along the way because the first thing is when I started digging and the way I've been done in the polls, the first thing I realized is the perspective I had was missing. I couldn't find much at all that was written by anyone who had actually done a poll in their life. There was a lot of academics, a lot of media people criticizing the polls. There still are. And some of them do a very good job, but they didn't come from the same perspective at all. They'd never actually seen how the sausage is made. And I kind of know, I've done like 3,000 survey research projects in my life. So, I just started going down this rabbit hole. I got a hold of all the polling data from 2000 to 2020, 6 elections, thousands of polls, put them in SPSS, stopped looking at what other people had written about the polls. I just wanted to do my own analysis really for my own reasons so that I could answer this question if a client should call. And I started writing stuff, and I just looked at it one day and said, this is a book that needs to be written. If I actually put this together, look at what other people have said, interview some pollsters, put a few stories in it, it could be a really compelling book. So, that's sort of the origin story of the book. It's accidental in a way. It's funny. I don't really consider myself to be a pollster, and I don't really consider myself to be an author, but I'm actually right now a best-selling author on the polls. So I guess I got to take credit for it at some point.
Very well done. Thinking about the data that you pulled on the polling side of things, did you come to any different conclusions to what the major players did?
Well, yeah, to some extent, the definitions are really important in this. People use different criteria to judge the polls, and I actually talk about this in the book. Pollsters will use their own criteria. Academics use a different one. And then real people use a different one, right? So to give an example, pollsters, if they're in their sampling area, they think they did a pretty good job, right, on the whole. And the reality is I looked at all the final polls from 2000 to 2016 to 2020, and only 54% of them were in their own stated sampling error, right? Now, anyone knows anything about statistics, and your audience certainly will know that number should be 95%, right? Yeah. That's literally what a sampling error means. So something's going wrong, right? We don't have random samples. the academics will use something called mean absolute error. They're just kind of looking at how far it is off. But the reality is, you can kind of go blah, 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 but that's not what media and people really think. They want to know, did you pick the winner and did you get the spread kind of right? That's what they want to know. And in the public's eyes, we're failing. In the pollsters' eyes, maybe not so much. And I actually came to that same conclusion. Big conclusion, the polls they're not really any better or worse than they ever have been, really. But they're still not good enough. That's the issue. They're not good enough. So anyway, so it kind of depends. It's like, are the polls doing a good job? The answer is like, it depends. I mean, I think it's fair to say they're not doing a good enough job. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, sure. So if there is such a lack of trust in polls, do we even need them? Should we keep persisting? Why do they even matter in the first place?
Yeah, they do. I said, if you write a book, you really learn stuff. I gained such an appreciation. You get head down in a career, and in any given time I'm doing 10 or 15 research projects. You don't think a lot about what you're doing. And I don't think I ever really recognized the importance of the insights field before I read this book. And so if you take the political side, public opinion is really important in any kind of democracy or representative democracy. And there's all these like intellectual thinkers like de Tocqueville and James Bryce, they'll really talk about how public opinion can really drive a democracy, and how in America it's kind of a little bit special that our leaders are really kind of tethered to public opinion. You don't really have a democracy if your leaders aren't paying attention to public opinion. So how do we convey that to them? Well, it's the polls, right? Mm-hmm. But I also, on the insight side of it, sort of realized the efficiency that we create for capitalism. Businesses would be kind of swaying in the wind without insights. We ground them to the needs of their customers. We allow this whole system that we have, because we don't notice it a lot because we're a support function, right? I have clients, I support them. They support people within their organization. We're never like front and center in a company, but we're actually really, really important. I feel like we're kind of the glue that holds democracy and capitalism together. So I don't want to rile people up too much about our field, but we're more important than you might think. And the issue is that's why we should really care that the polls get better. So even when they're executed flawlessly, they're going to be imperfect because the laws of statistics will always hold. And one of the things I did when I did this poll, I was able to reconnect with people from my past. And one of them was Humphrey Taylor, who's the former chairman of the Harris Poll, longtime chairman. And he told me when he thinks about polling's problems, he likes to kind of channel Winston Churchill. And I'm going to read a quote he said to me. He goes, "I like to say that polls are the worst possible way to measure public opinion, except for all the others." Right? So which is like, I'll take off on Winston Churchill. And he gave me that too late to put it in the book, but because I love it. But whether we like it or not, polls are going to remain our best way to convey our needs to our leaders and our consumer needs to companies. So we don't want to pull the plug on that electricity. It kind of drives everything. And I don't think it behooves anybody to be bashing the polls. No matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, or no matter where you are, I think all of us have a common interest in getting the polls to actually perform better than they have.
Yeah, sure. So what's the first step that we can take to improve the situation then?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot we can do. I definitely have suggestions in the book. I like, one thing I did is I stepped back and looked at the history of polling a little bit. And I would say this, the history of polling and reactions of pollsters to problems is sort of a good mistake of, it's a good case study of what not to do when something goes wrong. I actually feel that everyone kind of remembers the Dewey defeats Truman thing in 1948, right? Where the polls got it like way wrong, right? I actually, when I looked into it, realized that set back the insights field for a generation. The insights field didn't really take off until kind of the 70s, late 70s, 80s. And part of that had to do with technology and telephone penetration and things like that. But that mistake, people still, I go to a lot of offices. People still have that picture in their offices. Yeah. Everyone knows that picture with Truman holding up the newspaper headline, right? So I live in a little bit of fear that what happened in 2016, where we essentially predicted Hillary Clinton would win the presidency, that's going to do the same thing. So, but let's step back for a second. Think about how the polling industry has reacted in the past, right? Because they have this playbook they seem to go to after each election. Happened after 1948 too. Big commission becomes a commit. There's a commission of some sort or a group of experts of some sort. They get together after the election, right? And they try to figure out what went wrong. And almost always what they end up doing is proposing more complex sampling and weighting schemes to apply to the next election, right? And they do that because they kind of back test the model that would have worked in the past election had they used it, and then they assume it'll work going forward. And I'll give you a concrete example. In 2016, what we kind of realized, what the polling community kind of realized, is where they blew it in a bunch of ways, but where they really blew it was they undersampled lower educated people, voters, right? They didn't adequately sample them. That's an easy fix, right? You up the quotas or up your weighting scheme. So they did that thinking they had fixed everything, and I thought it was going to work. But what happened was a polling area that was about double the size in 2020. And the reason's this is, if you calibrate back to the previous election, that's going to work to the extent that the world doesn't change, right? Yes. It's a backward-looking approach. The generals always want to fight the last war, as they say, right? 2020 proved to be a very different year than 2016, right? We had higher voter turnout. COVID was going on. That was like a 1 in 100-year event. Even the ways we could vote changed, right? So we had this uncertainty that you couldn't really model to the past. So the most common question I've been getting in book talks that I do for this book, the most common question from people is, well, are they going to get it right in 2024? And I started giving these big, long answers to that. And I decided I just got to do the short answer. And the short answer is they will get it right in 2024 to the extent that you think the world won't change between 2020 and 2024. And I don't think it's ever a good bet to bet that the world won't change. Yeah. So they might, they really might. And here's something else I want to make sure I say is that this is what I don't like about the way the pollsters are reacting right now. And commentators are doing this too, this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to lower expectations for the next election. So they're trying to educate the public that the polls have never been really as good as they think. They're not as accurate as we think they are. That they're facing a lot of challenges and getting good samples. They're still doing a good job. We can still trust them, but you need to be able to think more probabilistically. We need to educate the media, lowering expectations, right? And that's all 100% true, but it is a losing marketing strategy. And I think about, like, if I was doing this for a business and I was doing a customer satisfaction study, and I found out, like, Michael, you have a product, and I find out that your customers don't like your product. It's falling short of the expectations. My counsel back to you would not be, what you need to do is lower the expectations of your customers. I would be telling you need to fix your product. Here's how you need to do it. Here's what we've learned, right? So that's what the pollsters are essentially trying to do. Is, again, I'm not saying their job is easy, but lowering expectations will not work. And that's essentially what they're trying to do. And again, I want to make sure I harp on this. I think the only way out of this box we're in is increasing response rates. I think it's the only way out.
Yeah, true. And then when you've got more data, more responses to be able to do, to analyze, etc., you've got more that you can, just feed into the machine, as it were. Yeah, better sample. So following on from this, what are the implications for both the media and the public when trust is so low for these polls?
Yeah, it's not a good thing. I think you're seeing a lot of what's happening. Again, I'm most familiar with what's going on, in America and back in the States. But one thing I was able to dig up this quote from Thomas Jefferson as well, and he said, "When the law of the majority ceases to be acknowledged, the law of the strongest takes its place." Right. So what we're seeing here is, I think, because we don't trust the polls, our leaders have stopped listening to public opinion like maybe we would want them to. And this creates this vacuum, and they're going to start listening to the loudest voices in the room. In the US, that tends to be these extreme voices, lobbyists, whoever has the most money, whoever has the biggest microphone. And our media landscape kind of amplifies these voices, social media in particular. And so our lack of trust in the polls kind of creates this vacuum where these extreme voices can come in and thrive. And, I like it, again, I want to get political on this, but loud voices are, like, I'd say the two big issues in America right now are abortion and gun rights are probably the two big hot button, things come and go, but they're the big ones right now. If we look at that right now, you're seeing extreme voices. out there, and you're seeing the public. I don't think I've ever seen a time in my lifetime where the public policies that are in place are more divergent from where public opinion is. And it's because we don't trust the polls. The polls show people are actually find middle ground on these issues, but you would never know it by listening to our politics. So, we have this problem. It's because we don't trust the polls to accurately convey opinions. That's why it just really, really matters. It's we trust media less because they're reliant on polls for content. And again, I want to make sure I bring it around. This is an insights podcast, right? This all doubles down to insights as well. I've been working in this field for like 30 years, and I don't think I've ever seen such a strong demand for insights, right? The demand is up. People really, market research is thriving right now. But I'll honestly tell you that the conundrum of my career is this. It's that despite all the advances in technology we have, I work with data sets all the time. It is harder to mine insights out of a data set now than it was 30 years ago. It's way harder to find the signal through the noise. And that's such a conundrum to me. With all I used to say, like, we're the only field I can think of that technology is, particularly telecommunications technology, has consistently made our jobs harder over time. The internet made our job harder. I mean, the old landline phone days were these great days for us. We could do random digit dial samples and they worked really well, right? So technology's hurt us. I don't think we recognize that sometimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's got such a ability to improve and help us, but yeah, like you say, the rise of bots, the distractions that all of our respondents are facing when undertaking surveys, etc.
On our poll, I asked people what they were. I started doing stuff like this on our surveys, but I asked people what else they were doing while they were taking our poll. Yeah. And it was something like 60% of the people on the poll for the book were doing something that you would consider distracting while they were taking our poll. They were either eating or fighting with their kids or watching TV, or some were driving and then like that, Wow. But yeah, it used to be, you think about it, in the old days, you were literally tethered to the phone. Like it was literally tethered to the wall. So we could control the environment, and it was pretty easy to control. Now you're probably on a mobile phone, you could be anywhere. You could be absolutely anywhere. So that it just increases variability, right? Which is never good in an experiment.
Sure. What role does the political leaning of media outlets play in the outcomes of the polling? Did you dive into this?
A little bit. Again, it's not a political book, but what might surprise people, at least in the States, is that the polling divisions of some, I'd say, major media outlets that people might consider to be pretty partisan, like Fox News or MSNBC on the other side, their polling divisions actually are really good. Yeah. There's no real strong house bias. A house bias is, do you consistently, lean to the right or left in your polling data? It's more what they do with the polls, right? So I tell people, it may surprise you, but when Fox News puts out a poll, it's probably pretty good. CNN's polls, they're probably pretty good. Their polling divisions are strong. So yeah, but they feed they try very hard. They try very hard. Then there's pollsters that don't. I mean, I don't want to name names, but there's pollsters that clearly are putting leading questions out there.
Yeah. I remember talking to someone else here in New Zealand, and it's in pollsters' best interest to serve the truth as accurately as it is represented. Very interesting. So I'm sure everyone has their subjective views on why trust in the polls have tanked. What reasons did you uncover as part of your research for this book as to why we are where we are?
Yeah, here's where I might say something that makes you a little uncomfortable, and other insights professionals. So challenge me, please. Okay, if you don't agree with this, right? I want to be respectful, right? I want to always make sure I'm doing that. But as you might know, and if you observe the industry, there's been a lot of investment in market research, particularly in technology, in about the last 5 years or so. Mm-hmm. And I chalk that up to that we're in this industry that has this like perfect storm going. There's increased demand for what we're doing, but at the same time, traditionally, we've been pretty slow to adapt to things. We're kind of dominated by academics who kind of do things very thoroughly, but very slowly. So you got this kind of staid old industry, maybe not adapting technology quick enough, but the demand is there. you're just kind of asking for venture capital and private equity firms that just want to swoop in and invest in this, and they're doing it, and it's wonderful. There's been a lot of investment in research technology, all good, right? But the issue I see is, there's always that adage that all projects need to do three things, right? They need to be fast, they need to be good, they need to be cheap, right? And in any given project, you can pick two of those, right? That's what they always say. So, but what I'm noticing is a lot of these investments, I'd say most of them, are really going towards making what we do faster and cheaper. And there is no doubt. I think I'm doing studies in I'd almost say 3 or 4 days now that used to take me 3 or 4 months to do. I mean, it's really absolutely incredible. And costs have come down too. I know suppliers don't want to tell clients that, but our costs have come down. It's because of these investments in technology. There's a lot of human stuff in the process of doing a study. They're just kind of made for automation. If you've ever done a poll, you realize like the fun part of analyzing the data, which can be automated too, but that's the 2 days at the end of the whole process, Yeah. But what I worry about is these investments have absolutely made things faster and cheaper, but have they really made things better? I'm not so sure. And so I want to try and say this is that when I started in 1989, telephone poll days, right? We did almost all telephone surveys. We had a telephone survey bank right in the back of our building, knew the interviewers, trained them. It was really, really a fun time. And at that time, when I first started, about 9 out of 10 people in the US would take part in polls, and we routinely got response rates between 70 and 80%. Wow. Right? So landline telephone penetration was like 95%. So, roughly 90% of the people are going to take a poll, and in any given study, we're going to get, even a bad poll is going to get 60%, 70, 80%, right? Now what's happening is it's in the US, about 1 in 10 people is willing to take a poll at all. And in the poll I did for the book, the average respondent told me that they had been surveyed 16 times in the past month, 16 times. So, and the industry response rate, it's probably 3 or 4%, right? So now we got a time. So we went from 90% are going to take our poll, 70% are going to respond. Now we're down to 10% of them will take our poll. And after we throw out all the bots and all the cleaning and stuff, we're probably left with about 3% of those. And to me, it is miraculous that we're still providing good data. Our methodologists, I take some shots at methodologists in this book, and I hope I'm being fair, but it's miraculous what they've been able to do with non-probability samples. And it's miraculous the polls are as close as they are given this. Like I told you, I've done a few book talks, and after every one of them, the audience members come up to you, and every one of them tells me they're just inundated with polls. That the most common thing they say to me is afterwards, like, "Oh my God, John, I can't do anything in my life without getting a poll. I go to the bank, I get a poll. Go to the hospital, I get a poll. Go to the car dealer. It's driving them crazy." And so there's just this defense mechanism, and only 1 in 10 of them will even do it for us anymore. So, and I think people, maybe I'm an older researcher now, but younger researchers might not realize there was a time when that was not the case. There was a time when people were excited if you called them for a poll. I started my career in a company that morphed to become Harris Interactive, and we're sort of a local pollster in New York State with a burgeoning reputation, but we were really well known in Western New York where I am. And if I would go to a cocktail party, right, and I would tell people where I worked, this is 1989, I'd get one of two reactions, right? I'd get either, "Hey, you guys called me the other day and that was a really cool experience."
Wow.
Or they would express anger at me that we had not called them, right? That is not, now I'm ashamed to say they're going to talk to me like I'm a car salesman or a member of Congress, right? It's really, really different. People really used to respect what we did a lot more than they do now. And so what I try to do in the book, because I realize this book, there's been things written about the polls that the only thing I really have to add is the perspective. So I try to pull in a lot of things that only someone working on the inside would know is a contributor to the problems we're having with polls and surveys. And I'll give you an example. I mean, I got a whole bunch of them in the book, but I'll give you just a really quick one. Is I don't think people that observe the polls understand that for the most part, polls are money-losing things for the pollster. They're so valuable, these media partnerships with a pollster, that they're very competitively bid, break even at best, the polling work, right? And so that creates a lot of disincentives within a firm just to start. But I thought about it more. One of the coolest things about our industry is I have nothing against the large companies. I used to work with one of the large companies. There's brilliant people there. But unlike a lot of fields, some of the best brain power is in smaller companies like mine, these 4 or 5 person companies or 30 person. There's a lot of them. We work with some of the biggest research spenders in the country, recognize that, and will work with my little firm. There's not a single, and there's a lot of talent on that bench, right? None of that talent is employed going after the polls, because I could never become a pollster. I can't afford that. And I'll tell you, I was thinking about it before this call. I was kind of going over this, thinking that the 3 best pollsters I know right now, none of them are in a position to be doing the polls, given where they are with their employment, because they're not employed with a big pollster anymore. And they're the 3 best methodologists I can name. Not one of them right now is doing anything with the polls. So I try to do that in the book. If you thought that was cool, there's a lot of things like that in the book. I try to do things like that. If you're on the inside of research, you'll kind of understand, say, yeah, that is contributing to the problems we have with the polls. And most people aren't probably thinking about that. I'll give you another one really quick.
Sure.
Like all the pollsters are using the same sampling companies, right? There's only so many ways to get a good national sample. I mean, I know there's a lot of sampling companies, but most of the major pollsters are kind of using the same 1 or 2. So, what's that's a problem too, because they're getting surveyed. Now they're getting surveyed. I think I asked how many times you have been surveyed regarding the election, not just polls. And that was like over the course of the thing, like dozens of times. So same people are getting surveyed over and over.
So it would be a fascinating maths problem to understand. If we were to answer every poll, every survey that we were given, how much of our time would we have left in the day?
Yeah. I calculated once, I don't know the numbers. I calculated once, like, it actually I have it in the book. I don't remember what it was. Like, I figured out I've done like 3,000 projects. The average sample size was probably this. The average survey length was probably like 12 minutes. It was something like, I'd taken up 10 lifetimes of people's time. But it's funny, right? It is funny, but there's a lot of responsibility in that. You gotta have a lot of empathy for that. You're taking up people's time. And, I think we've lost, I talk a lot about this in the book, is that I am blessed that I grew up in this industry during the telephone days. And because this is how it went. This is how I would design a study in the early 90s, right? Telephone center in the back of our building. I would write a questionnaire during the day. Telephone center is going at night. I would brief the interviewers, right? Then I would get on the phone myself and do a few interviews. And then at the end of the night, I would debrief with the interviewers, right? And the interviewers were not shy at all about telling me when my questions weren't very good. And I could hear it live. I would be on the phone with people. I'd be monitoring surveys. I'd come in the next day, fix the poll. You got to really learn, what it was like to interrupt somebody's dinner. And is this question really worth what you're doing? Now, you fast forward now, I really think younger survey writers are really at a disadvantage that they didn't have that experience, because you get none of that feedback. You throw a question at someone online and you never really see or understand if that question is working in a way that we did back in the day. So, empathy for respondents is I have seen some, I get a little frustrated what goes on at the conferences and stuff, because I don't think they're talking about the right things, but I have seen some events and stuff that cover, we've got to worry about empathy for the respondents. And I really kind of applaud that.
Yeah, and I had a conversation a while back on recapturing the human element, being far more human-centric in our marketing. So it's a really, in our market research, sorry, it's a really good point. Yeah. So on the, you mentioned the top 3 pollsters that you know of aren't working on the polls anymore. Do you think there is an industry-wide play, from an Insights Association or whatnot, to gather together around polling time and actually produce a bit more of an independent / collaborative poll to try and recapture some of that trust?
Well, there's a couple of things I think the associations could be doing differently. And I think APOR and, APOR is probably a little different. APOR is the the Association of Pollsters, right? Not the Insights is more insights professionals, right? And I think APOR is sort of seen as an authority and they have a lot of academics there, as well as practitioners. I think the issue with APOR is, or not the issue, but what I would like to see them do is I'd like to see them sort of evolve from being an advocate for the pollsters to being someone that kind of is a little bit more of a watchdog referee for them. We lost a lot. I do know a lot about the history of polls, but there's sort of this wave of second wave pollsters. Not the people that knew that not George Gallup and Roper, but the people that knew them. It's people like Andrew Kohut or Harry O'Neill from Roper, or Warren Matofsky, or Humphrey Taylor. They were sort of in control of the associations, or really important people in the associations for a while, and they were relentless about standards and quality. And as they've sort of, well, a lot of them aren't with us anymore, unfortunately, but as they've sort of cycled off, you don't see the same sort of advocacy for that. You see more of it. They seem more defensive now to me. So anyway, I think we need a referee. That's one of I have like 10 suggestions of what we need. We need some sort of referee. So how do you know when you read a poll if it's any good? We need some sort of referee that says this was at least done to certain standards, all that. And there are standards out there where there's really no referee. And the Insights Association, I think, it's not just any association or any publication that, and even, I even say even your podcast is focus more on response rates. Like I was listening to the previous ones you did, and I'm like, I'm sort of screaming at you and you can't hear me saying, ask them about the 95% that never show up to the survey to begin with. It's like what they're doing is important. I'm definitely not denying that, but we really got to worry. It's a methodological box. You can't wait your way around the fact that the non-response bias that is there. We worry about it, but it just isn't going to get any better, and it's not going in the right directions. I worry. I really do worry. It's a field I love, and I really worry that it is it's going to change, but there's always going to be a need for survey research. I don't see that going away. So that's why I worry about it.
Okay, so on that point then, like, what are some ways that you think we can improve, start reaching that 95%?
Yeah, it's funny. I list 10 things in the book, and they all center on two themes. One theme is trust, and the other is simplicity, right? So we're caught in a vicious cycle, right? The public doesn't trust the polls because they don't think they're accurate, and they're not accurate because people don't trust the polls and they won't take part in them. Got to break that. We have to break that cycle. How do we do it? I don't want to throw up my arms too much. It's not going to be easy, but we got to remember it wasn't always this way. We can think back when polls start, George Gallup and Roper and Lewis Harris, they controlled the content of the poll. Today's polling, at least in the US, is dominated by the media. The polls are just kind of carrying the poll out. The media is driving the content, the analysis. That's not the way it was. And I think it's but it is a case in journalism where journalists are creating their own stories, which I think borders on unethical. I think the old days, the way it was Gallup would do a poll. Imagine newspapers were big. You remember what newspapers were, right? Yeah. Gallup would do a poll, and he had a column called America Speaks. And he would write a column and he would syndicate it out and every major newspaper in America covered it, right? And everyone was really kind of excited to see because George Gallup could tell us what we thought about ourselves. There was just this incredible trust. And I don't know if we can get that back, but I do think the media need to get more into the situation where they're reporting on the polls rather than driving the content of them. Sure. Mainly because the media have become more and more partisan. The pollsters really have not. So trust is hard. You get things like Gallup. Gallup is the only part of our study is Gallup's the only pollster in America that has significant name recognition and trust. And Gallup doesn't do election polls anymore. They opted out of them because they did a real rough year in 2012, and they opted out of them because it's not worth the heat. So that's really unfortunate. It's really unfortunate for our industry that they did that. And so, trust is really, so I go through things. What do you do when you have, I just think about like a client, think about clients that were having a problem with trust. I go to brand, right? That's what a brand is. So how do we establish a brand? Do we, ally with people, institutions? The college polling centers aren't a bad idea. People do seem to trust the college. On our poll, they trust the college polling centers more than the name brand pollsters. And the 538 ratings of the college polling centers are very high. So what I'd like to see is, I got to be careful. I don't want to say this inappropriately, but the colleges that do the polls in America are sort of these regional universities. They're good universities, but they're not, nationally known as being highly selective, we don't have the Stanford poll or the Princeton poll or the Yale poll or the Harvard poll. We need an institution like that. That might help. So I think brand is really something that we could use to establish trust. I have other ideas like Pollsters, we have this thing, and I would suppose this is worldwide, that we have this thing called the Roper Center at Cornell University, which is sort of this repository for polls. A lot of pollsters just will give them the results. And it's really kind of cool library, by the way. You can look at what American opinion looked like forever, or worldwide opinion like forever. But we should mandate that. Some polls aren't released, right? So it takes a lot of courage to, this is something, I should say this too, this is something Humphrey Taylor said to me as well in an email. He said, sort of the problem is, if we do our polls perfectly, I'm paraphrasing him, but if we do our polls perfectly, 1 out of 20 times it's going to be outside the sampling area. It's going to look bad. He goes, and that's the only one everyone's going to remember. And that's part of the problem. Is like, if you see a pollster that says, look, we've hit it 100 times in a row, well, they shouldn't hit it 100 times in a row. They should hit it 95 out of 100 times, right? Yeah. So you worry about we have to have some tolerance that there's going to be these things that look like outliers. But there's this thing called herding, where pollsters are under a lot of pressure. If everyone's putting a poll out there saying Biden's going to win by 8 points, Biden's going to win by 8 points, and all of a sudden he's going to win by 1 point, I might not release that poll, because it can ruin my company, and there's a lot of pressure on that, and there's a lot of evidence that it actually occurs. But I'm saying, we have to get the back. There's a publication bias in the Roper Center. Academics use that to study the polls, but the bad polls don't get in there. So, it's sort of like medical research. When it doesn't kind of prove the worth of the drug, it doesn't get published. And that's how you need that to get published for science to go forward. I mean, the same kind of thing with the polls. So yeah, it's interesting. So that's trust. There's a lot around trust, and I talk about that a lot in the book. And the other part is simplicity. There's this, I'm firmly of the opinion that we're overcomplicating our jobs. All we're really trying to do is get a representative sample of people, a few people to answer a question so we can say what the whole group thinks. And that gets lost on us a lot. It's pretty simple, really. And we have this pollster in America that she's from Iowa, and many people consider her to be the best pollster in America. She says her methods are so simple a second grader could come up with them, right? And I looked into them a little bit, and I didn't quite agree with her there, but they're very old school, and they look a lot more like what we were doing in 1989 than what's doing now. And she's regarded as the best pollster in America by 538. She has an A+ rating, seems to nail it pretty much every time. And so, this is how I end the book. I end the book with this. This is the very end, last quote of the book, that I say, just imagine we made for this kind of world. Imagine a future for a second with me. Imagine a world where every person invited to a survey agreed to participate and gave honest answer. Do you think we'd have any problems predicting who the next president would be? So what I struggle with is, and I think everyone would agree with that, like everyone you ever approach would take your survey, give honest answers, we wouldn't have any of these data quality problems, right? I want the industry to work more towards that ideal. We're never going to get there, right? Yeah. But we're going the wrong direction. If anything, again, I got to be really careful. I know you're in the technology space, right? I want to be really careful, but just figuring out how to make sure though that the 3 or 5% that come to our poll end up being good people is, you're kind of rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic here. We got to keep the whole thing from sinking as well. It's not that that's not valuable, but I don't think it's the core problem. And I think that's the through line of the whole book. I don't think that's the core problem that we're faced with.
That's a good point. So finally, and we've touched on this before or throughout the podcast, so New Zealand has been seeing a downward trend of voter turnout over our elections, both at a local and national level, with the exception of the 2020 national elections. From your findings, is trust also in polling impacting voter turnout too?
Yeah, and I should note this trust issue and participation, all this is worldwide. I mean, my data is all from the US, but it's really it's a pretty much a worldwide thing in any democracy, I would say. And I got to be fair, I'm not a political scientist, and I'm definitely not an expert on New Zealand politics. And again, an election turnout in the US was really high in 2020, but the polls definitely have an influence on the elections, right? In the US, they determined who gets to be on the debate stage in the last 2 elections. And I would say everywhere the polls affect fundraising. So, if you want to be a candidate for office, showing poll success is how you get the money so that you can become a candidate for office. So the polls, fairly or unfairly, are a real big part of the process. And I struggle with that sometimes, the ethics of that. Are we too influential? And I sort of come down on the side of, well, if you're doing them and you're doing them accurately, there's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with putting out there an accurate assessment of what public opinion looks like. It's when we don't do them accurately that it can provide a disservice. And there's examples of that, in the book as well. And I'll give you an example of that. Like it's maybe an anecdote, may or may not be true, but the Brexit vote in 2016, at that time, I think the British population roughly kind of trusted the pollsters, right? And the polls indicated pretty strongly that the UK was going to remain in the EU, right? And so the speculation is because they trusted the pollsters, and the pollsters said it wasn't even going to be close, the Remains remained at home and they lost the election, right? So I would actually say like distrust in the polls might actually increase voter turnout. If I think Biden's going to win by 8 points, maybe I'll show up if I'm a Biden supporter, maybe I won't. If I don't trust the polls, I better get there. So I'm not a political scientist, but the polls they influence the debate. And that's a good use of polls. By the way, Gallup, I look back, I'd learned a lot about George Gallup because he kind of hated pre-election polls, horse race polling. He just saw it as a litmus test. What he liked was opinion polling. His treatise was called The Pulse of Democracy, right? He felt an accurate assessment of opinion is just such a great thing for democracy. The only thing he liked about election polls is that it kind of proved the case for the opinion polls. So he would just assume not done election polls, but he kind of had to because it's this litmus test for how good the opinion polls are. So he didn't like them either. So anyway, I'm not a political scientist, but the polls do actually have an influence on the election, and I think it's debatable whether that influence is positive or negative.
For sure. Yes, it's all very interesting. So I thank you so much for the thoughts that you've given today. Really important topic for us all to consider, not just in the insights industry, but just in the further afield, everyone, doesn't it? It's these polls are so important, as we've said. So if I can recap what we've talked about today, we do have serious data quality issues across all types of survey research and not just these election polls. And you quite rightly said one of the biggest things that we can do to address the accuracy of polls is to address the 95%, those that aren't willing to engage in polling, just so we can increase the sample, have it more representative, and then give analysts more to work with. You gave us a little bit of background in terms of the context around which you wrote this book. You're 30 plus years in the market research sector, 15 of those at Harris Poll. So you bring a lot of experience and hands-on knowledge into writing the book. You shed some light on methodologies for writing the book, the analysis that you did from back in the 2000s right through to today of polls and how they went in reality. You looked at the trust in polls as well, why we need them, and how they are so important for democracy, how they can even help, as you said, with getting people up onto the stage for having those debates, which are really important for people to see how people think, how people talk, what policies, etc. they're going to be using. We looked at the public, the implications between for the media and for the public when trust is so low, and the implication for the public is almost that politicians start listening to the loudest voices, not necessarily the majority. And this is, I guess, technology and the media side of things, social media, etc., is really amplifying this as well. We talked about, quite interestingly, the way where historically market research in the polling surveys used to be, you were chained to a landline, and so you couldn't be distracted except for what little Johnny was doing at the back or whatnot. So you had far less distractions and far greater response rates, up to the 70%, which is amazing, unheard of these days. You gave us some suggestions in terms of how we can improve, which really is around trust and simplicity, and some really good points there. And we lastly just touched on as well how polls can also improve voter turnout as well. Even the lack of trust can sometimes increase voter turnout as well. So I mean, it's a two-sided coin, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yes, I think that covers it. Anything you'd like to add before we wrap, John?
Yeah, just maybe just the one thing, that feel good about yourself if you're in the insights industry. I think your job is probably more important than you recognize, and it took me 30 years to figure that out. So if you're young and you're in the industry, feel good about what you're doing. It's really important. That's
right. We do play such an important role in helping to be that litmus test, to be that voice of society. So yes, I completely agree with you there. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode today, John.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot too, Michael. I love what you do with this podcast. I think it's a great service to the industry. So thank you for doing the podcast. I really appreciate it.
That's right. Thank you for taking the time to write the book outside of your day job as well. I know just how much effort goes into writing a book like that as well. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to the listeners out there as well who've joined us today. Really appreciate it if you subscribe to the podcast, shared it with others, or left a review. And feel free to check out John's book as well, Poll-arized: Why Americans Don't Trust the Polls. So thank you so much, and thank you for listening to Now That's Significant.